My mother, Ida Comparin, now 94 years old, was born in 1928 in New York City, in Queens. Her parents were poor immigrants from southern Italy. She was the youngest of five children. Her father died when she was 8, her mother when she was 16. Supported by her siblings, she finished high school, college, and even got a master's degree in library science. An immigrant story, like many we have heard. After graduating, she wished to travel to see some of the world. She joined the Army as a librarian, part of the support services for our huge post World War II overseas military bases, hoping to go to Europe. Instead, she was sent to Japan. The sea passage was rough, as she tells it. Everyone on board got seasick, except for a small group of people playing cards. I must learn that card game, she told herself. And when in Japan, she approached one of the players, a nurse, and asked if she might learn. The game was bridge, and they needed a fourth. But the nurse hesitated, finally confiding that all of the group, a doctor, another nurse, like her, were African American. Would my mother be okay with that? For many years, I had extended family still living in Queens, near where my mother grew up. While visiting, I at times heard racist comments from cousins and aunts and uncles, some blunt and ugly, some whispered, often the common sense racism prevalent then and now. Common sense, evoking the ordinariness, pervasiveness, and legitimacy of much social knowledge. Those things that are just the way they are, needing no elaboration. For many, it simply seems true, common sense, that blacks prefer welfare to work, that undocumented immigrants breed crime, that Islam spawns violence. But back to my mother and her childhood neighborhoods, there have long been tensions between and among immigrant groups and African Americans. And the immigrant experience has often been twisted to validate racist myths. Often have I heard, well, my Irish, Italian, Polish grandparents came from nothing and they are not still fill in the blank. But history is never so simple. Today, many look askance at Columbus Day, rightfully concerned for a celebration of colonialism and the ensuing harm to indigenous people. But we neglect the more complex history. Columbus Day was initially declared a one-time national celebration in 1892. The proclamation was part of a wider effort to placate Italian Americans and ease diplomatic tensions with Italy after the 1891 lynchings of 11 Italian Americans in New Orleans, the largest single mass lynching in American history. Southern Italian immigrants, many of them poor laborers, not yet considered white. Understanding race and racism will not explain everything about America, but if we do not understand race and racism, we will not fully understand anything about America. Italians would, like the Irish and many other immigrant groups, eventually join the American Club of White Races. The transition, perhaps, was aided by the continued subjugation of Black Americans. Keep one group at the bottom always available for political and economic exploitation and scapegoating, boosting others above that bottom rung, often just above, precariously, so that they too might be kept in insecurity, fearful of rocking the boat. My mother, well, she would go on to become quite a good bridge player. In telling the story, my mother said, "Oh, I didn't care." It seemed to my mother had been grateful that they had accepted her. I tell this story not to hold up my mother as a paragon of racial progressiveness, but rather to tell how growing up in a different time and place, she saw things differently, not without all prejudice, but differently. I heard this story many years ago, but it was only more recently that I thought to ask my mother about her experiences of race when growing up. How was it, I wondered, that she was comfortable in that bridge group? Certainly, her world in Queens, when I later saw it, was filled with racist ideas. What had she thought about black people growing up? My mother thought for a few moments, remembering back to her childhood, back to the 1930s. Ideas of white racial supremacy were certainly long entrenched by then, but I imagine for these poor first generation immigrants struggling to get by, it was not a front burner matter. According to historian George Frederickson, the word racism came into common usage in the 1930s when a new word was required to describe the theories on which the Nazis based their persecution of the Jews. Thinking back to her childhood growing up poor, my mother said, "We admired them, the black people near us, even envied them a bit. They had nicer homes and clothes than we did." My mother, it turns out, lived near a black neighborhood, a neighborhood more prosperous than her own. My mother's memory from a different era, so matter of factly spoken, revealed a different truth to me. I knew about such neighborhoods, historically, intellectually at least. I knew about the prosperous Greenwood district in Tulsa, known as the Black Wall Street, destroyed by a white supremacist terrorist massacre in 1921. I even knew from firsthand accounts of Harlem neighborhoods near where I lived in New York City. But the truth for me, my default truth, common sense, was that a black neighborhood must be a poor neighborhood. Even with all my anti racism work, all the books I had read, all the workshops I had attended or led, my imagination was shrunken, enfeebled by the omnipresent distortions of my time, our time. Hearing my mother's story, a different American history flashed before me. Imagine the fabled 40 acres and a mule offered as compensation for the formerly enslaved. Imagine the promises of Reconstruction honored, Black representatives in our legislatures, thriving Black enterprises, New Deal protections, the GI Bill, mortgage guarantees extended to all. But not for exploitation and oppression, enslavement, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, redlining, and all the racist ideas and policies spawned to support that oppression, we could all of us be living in a very different America, an America where a black neighborhood is not, in common sense, a poor neighborhood. Long gone are whites only signs. Legal segregation has been outlawed. Racial epithets are now rarely openly used by public officials. The arc of history has been bent toward justice somewhat since the 1930s. But the forces of oppression have not withered away and died. Rather, they have adapted and pushed back and often become more nuanced, more insidious. Language and images trafficked to hide truth and contort understanding. What pictures come to mind when we hear terms like sketchy neighborhood, drug user, single mother? These racist adaptations, so broad in scope, cannot be fully examined in one Sunday sermon. Today, I will focus on one aspect of this corrosive evolution, the use of coded racial language, or racial dog whistles. As late as 1962, the American public perceived Republicans and Democrats to be similarly, if tepidly, committed to racial justice. Yes, Richard Nixon received 32% of the African American vote in the 1960 presidential race against JFK. But this began to change dramatically in 1964. The civil rights movement was moving forcefully forward. The Supreme Court, in a rare era of support for civil rights, was overturning decades of racist precedents. Again, I imagine an alternate history. The efforts of Martin Luther King and so many civil rights advocates had generated a moment of national opportunity, one not seen since Reconstruction, an opportunity for our leaders to finally join together. to work together to end racial oppression and exploitation. But such a turn was not to be. As reported by conservative journalist Robert Novak after attending a Republican National Committee meeting in 1963, a good many, perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. The murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protests presented us with another opportunity for repair and justice, an opportunity again cynically twisted and exploited by some to further entrenched racist ideas and impression. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. By the 1960s, perceptions, if not reality, had begun to change. Even these cynical political strategists saw that one could no longer shout the N-word, one could no longer be openly racist. How then have political leaders managed to elicit racial loyalty despite a national revulsion toward racism? The answer lies in the GOP's use of coded language. Ian Haney Lopez tells us in his 2014 book, Dog Whistle Politics, how coded racial appeals have reinvented racism and wrecked the middle class. He writes, its racial entreaties operate like a dog whistle, a metaphor that pushes us to recognize that modern racial pandering always operates on two levels, inaudible and easily denied in one range, yet stimulating strong reactions in another. Don't openly say, federal courts shouldn't be able to force us to desegregate our schools. Instead say states' rights. Don't say, I won't have my child bused to an integrated school. Say forced busing, even though your child already takes a school bus and Black children are bused right past a local school, headed miles away to a school that they are allowed to attend. Don't condemn people's rights to assemble, to march for long denied civil rights. Rather express those common sense concerns like law and order or protecting property rights. Don't say lazy or always waiting for handouts when you can say welfare queen, quickly conjuring a whole world of racist lies and myths. And sadly, these appeals have been made by Democrats as well. Let us not forget 3 strikes and you're out and end welfare as we know it and super predators. Talk about sketchy neighborhoods, affirmative action is anti-white racism. These messages pour into our society, tainting our understanding. Media reports about food stamps are far more likely to display Black families, even in areas where the majorities of recipients are white. On and on. States' rights, welfare queen. Many racial dog whistles have become easier for many of us to detect. But for others, the masquerade is more convincing. Take colorblindness, an idea very prominent in recent Supreme Court decisions. As Lopez tells us, today the dominant etiquette around race is colorblindness. It has a strong moral appeal, for it laudably envisions an ideal world in which race is no longer relevant to how we perceive or treat each other. It also has an intuitive, practical appeal. To get beyond race, colorblindness urges the best strategy is to immediately stop recognizing and talking about race. But the reality, Lopez reminds us, is quite different. The lofty goal behind colorblindness, we are continually assured, is racial justice. But in practice, just as with states' rights, colorblindness translates to an opposition to integration. Its attraction lies in that it sounds fair, even as it fosters the impression that discrimination against whites is rampant and works assiduously to defeat policies actually geared to achieving integration. Unquote. Regarding affirmative action, and specifically arguments of the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, Lopez tells us colorblindness shifts the harm of racism from degradation, exclusion, and exploitation to being treated differently on the basis of a socially irrelevant characteristics. no matter how benign the motive. Thomas argues that government sponsored racial discrimination based on benign prejudice is just as noxious as discrimination based on malicious prejudice. In each case, it is racial discrimination, pure and simple. Nice common sense there. But is affirmative action the same thing as Jim Crow segregation, Lopez asks? Or the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II or Native American genocide? Of course not. Racism's harm lies in dehumanization and violence, not in mere differentiation, and certainly not in racial distinction made in order to repair racism's painful legacies. Yet by defining race as a superficial characteristic and racism as any use of race, colorblindness misrepresents affirmative action as the moral equivalent of racial oppression. New York Times columnist Jamel Bouie offers a similar analysis in considering Chief Justice John Roberts' reasoning in the recent affirmative action case Students for Fairness versus Harvard. Roberts asserts that eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it, Bouie writes. It's Roberts' view that the Constitution is colorblind and sees no racial distinctions. While Roberts might mention race, discrimination based on race, and racial discrimination, he doesn't discuss racism. Bouie continues, this, you might say, is the Roberts two-step. He takes racism, a system of subjugation and social control, and removes the racists. What's left is the mark of racism. That is race. To remove racism and racists from the equation is to pretend there's no social force to push against, no inequality to rectify. Unquote from Mr. Bouie. This acknowledgement of race can be a tricky line to walk, especially for those of us who identify as white. We want to embrace the fullness of our neighbors, not focus solely on some single characteristic, race, gender, national origin. And we are called by this faith to acknowledge all that makes each of us worthy. But we must not forget, ignore, deny the features of society that burden individuals and groups differently. The black father must have the talk with his son about police stops. The black mother-to-be must overcome a doctor's dismissal of her reported pain. On and on. The fantastical world inhabited by Justice Roberts and Thomas is still far, far away. What is our position on racial colorblindness? As a faith, as a congregation, what is yours? These questions challenge us, make no mistake about it, and I am certain some here will challenge me on these views of racial colorblindness. I welcome your respectful arguments. We display a large Black Lives Matter banner on the front of our church, prominently there for all to see. Not all UU congregations could embrace such a display. Black Lives Matter communicates many messages. One of them is a repudiation of racial colorblindness. As we at UU Schenectady have acknowledged many times, this stuff is difficult, emotionally, culturally, intellectually, personally. We have all heard the I have a dream speech. We know about inequities, past and present. And we often feel that our life experiences alone can inform full understanding. But too often we can resort to and argue from common sense. Many times at community meetings or reading letters to the editor, an argument begins, Webster defines race as, or defines racism as. In my early grappling with racism, I too pulled out the dictionary, and others listened attentively. But imagine attending a mental health workshop where the facilitator began, Webster's defines schizophrenia as, or an astrophysics lecture where a speaker began, Webster's defines general relativity as. Beware the dictionary. Many disciplines are complex. Race theory is complex. But we do not see Supreme Court justices arguing that schizophrenia or physics are simple. Many of us at UUSS have struggled with this, have faced these challenges, tried to understand. We have delved into the works of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi, Michelle Williams, Toni Morrison, Robin DiAngelo, and so many other informed scholars and artists. Don't be fooled. Webster's cannot suffice to unmask racial dog whistles. Chief Justice Roberts, lost in racial colorblindness, extols the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. To my ears, that is a dictionary deep argument. Ours is a faith that asserts the worth and dignity of every person, that asserts justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, that asserts a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I side with Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who urges the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race and to apply the Constitution with eyes open to the unfortunate effects of centuries of racial discrimination. Let us bring both and thinking. Let us bring courage. Let us be emboldened and supported by our faith in each other in this journey. In the words of the 19th century Unitarian minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure of experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. Amen and blessed be.